All right, today we're going on a journey deep into the Himalayas. We're going to explore a spiritual landscape that's been hiding in plain sight for, well, thousands of years, existing right alongside one of the world's most famous religions.
So when I say Tibetan spirituality, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For most of us, it's images just like these, right? Monks in their deep crimson robes, those peaceful, iconic stupas, and maybe even the Dalai Lama himself. These are the powerful symbols of Tibetan Buddhism, a tradition that people all over the world look to for wisdom. But that's only part of the story. What if I told you there's another tradition, just as ancient, that lives right alongside it? It uses a symbol that might look familiar. It's called the Zhang-Zhung. But look closely. Notice how it turns in the opposite direction of the Buddha symbol. That one small detail, that counterclockwise turn, well, it changes absolutely everything. So we're about to step off the well-trodden path. For centuries, this other tradition, which is called Bon, has been pretty misunderstood. A lot of people have dismissed it as just a kind of primitive precursor to Buddhism or maybe even a heresy. But the reality? Oh, it's so much more complex and, frankly, way more fascinating. This is Zhang-Zhung Bon, which translates to eternal Bon. And for its followers, the Bonfos, this is not just some offshoot of Buddhism. No way. They see it as a complete and totally distinct spiritual path. Its main symbol, the Zhang-Zhung, stands for permanence, for the indestructible nature of truth, which is actually very similar to what the Vajra, or the diamond, represents in Buddhism. Now here's where it gets really interesting. To understand Bon, we can't start our journey in India, where Buddhism was born. Nope, we have to travel much further west, to a mystical, almost mythical homeland that is absolutely central to the Bon faith. According to the Bonpo scriptures, the whole tradition comes from this hidden land called Olmo Lungring. Now, this isn't a spot you can find on Google Maps. It's described more as a pure dimension, a kind of sacred sanctuary that's often identified with the legendary land of Shambhala. It's a place you can only get to if you're spiritually ready. And the descriptions of Olmo Lungring are just epic. At its very heart is a gigantic 9-story crystal mountain, which represents the 9 ways of Bon. From its base flow 4 sacred rivers, and surrounding this mountain are these concentric regions with cities and palaces, all of it encircled by a vast ocean and a wall of snow-capped mountains. It's a perfectly designed spiritual paradise. And from this sacred land came Bon's founder, a figure named Tonpa Shenrab. The tradition says he was born there as a prince almost 18,000 years ago. Now, his story is really different from the Buddha's. Unlike Buddha Shakyamuni, who renounced his royal life after he saw suffering, Tonpa Shenrab was supposedly born enlightened. He traveled all over as a layman and a king, spreading the Bon teachings before finally becoming a monk much later in his life. Okay, so here's where things can get a little confusing. If you were to visit a Bon monastery today, you could easily be forgiven for thinking you'd walked into a Buddhist one. The robes, the incense, the art, the stupas, on the surface they can look almost identical. And this is where the confusion really begins. You see, both traditions share this deep philosophical foundation. They both believe in a world of suffering called samsara, the law of karma, the idea of rebirth, and the ultimate goal of achieving liberation. They both have monks, they both have reincarnated lamas, and their religious art and architecture look incredibly similar. So you can see why, for centuries, a lot of people just dismissed Bon as some kind of copy of Buddhism. But even with all those visual similarities, the core differences are profound. The source of their religious authority is completely different. One is the Buddha from India, the other is Tonpa Shenrab from Olmo Lungring. They even have their own distinct core mantras, but the most obvious, visible difference is direction. Bonpos walk around holy sites and spin their prayer wheels counterclockwise, following the turn of their sacred Zhang-Zhung. It's that different turn we saw right at the beginning. Another common misconception we have to talk about is this idea that Bon is just primitive shamanism. And while it's true that it includes ancient practices for things like healing and communicating with spirits, that's really just one small piece of a much larger and highly sophisticated system that's known as the 9 ways of Bon. All of the teachings are organized into what they call the 9 ways of Bon, which you can visualize as a 9-tiered pyramid. The lower levels, the causal ways, deal with things like prediction and rituals for the afterlife. But as you move up, you progress to the higher paths of Sutra and Tantra, and it all culminates at the very top with Dzogchen, or the Great Perfection, which is this incredibly profound teaching about the ultimate nature of the mind.
So, you might be wondering, if this tradition is so ancient and so well developed, why is it so little known? Well, the story of Bon is really a story of incredible resilience in the face of centuries of being marginalized and even persecuted.
Bon tradition talks about two major persecutions in its history. The first one was centuries before Buddhism even arrived in Tibet, and the second was in the 8th century when Buddhism was made the state religion. During these times, Bonpo priests were banished and their sacred texts were destroyed. But here's the amazing part. They preserved their teachings by hiding them as terma, or treasure texts, which were meant to be rediscovered centuries later by certain destined individuals. And this incredible practice allowed Bon to re-emerge in the 11th century and eventually build these great monastic centers like Menri.
So, after centuries of being pushed to the very edges of society, Bon hasn't just survived. It's now experiencing a modern renaissance. Today, it's officially recognized by the Tibetan government in exile as one of the 5 major spiritual schools of Tibet, and it's gaining followers and respect all around the globe.
The story of Bon is just such a powerful reminder that what we usually see as the main story is rarely the whole story. You know, sometimes all it takes is being willing to look in a different direction, to take that counterclockwise turn, to discover a whole universe of wisdom you never even knew was there.